Depending on what size, that's how much yarn you're going to need, the same amount of each color. You're also going to need a bunch of pieces of waste yarn, a crochet hook, scissors, and a darning needle. And of course, your knitting machine. I'm using the Addi Professional 22 needle knitting machine. Beginning from the first black peg, we're going to take a piece of your waste yarn and begin by casting on by putting the yarn in front and in back, alternating between each peg. When you've reached the end of the row, you should finish off with behind a peg, and now you can secure your yarn into the yarn feeder, and we're going to knit a few rows with the waste yarn. After a few rows, make sure you're finishing with the waste yarn in the last white peg, and right before the first black one, place the tail of your waste yarn inside. Now we are going to begin with our first main color. So grab your yarn, place it in the yarn feeder, and make sure that it's going to begin with the first black peg. That's going to be the start of the row. And right before you start turning, make sure to reset your row counter. Since the first few stitches are going to be pretty loose, then while you're turning, hold the two tails a little bit tight down for those first few stitches that you're turning. Make sure that your working yarn is nice and secure. Even after the first row, just check to see that it's on the needle as it's supposed to be. And then you can continue knitting, and we're going to make 14 rows with our first color. When you're coming close to finishing 14 rows, on the last row, go slowly so you shouldn't miss the first stitch. Stop right before that first black one, and now you can cut off your first color and change to your second color. Remember to reset your row counter, and just like we did before, hold down the two tails a little bit so that they shouldn't get too loose. And beginning with the first black needle, we're going to begin again 14 rows with our second color. Once that's done, change back to your first color. Remember to reset the row counter and continue making 14 rows of each color, and continue doing these squares for as long as you would like your panel to be, finishing off the panel with the opposite color of what you've started with. Once your panel is long enough, change to waste yarn and do a few rows with the waste yarn. When your waste yarn is finished, just continue turning until your work comes off the machine. And here our panel is nice and ready. Repeat this process for as many panels as you would like for your blanket. Once all your panels are done, now we go on to the next step, which is closing all those little tails that we left from changing colors. So take your panel and turn it inside out. Then, by each color change, make carefully a double knot. We don't want it to be too tight and too loose, so try to make it just right. Remember to tie together only the tails of the main colors and not the tails with the waste yarn. Now you can snip off some of the tail, but leaving a little bit so it shouldn't come out. Turn your work back to the right side. And now we are going to begin closing the panels on the top and the bottom. And for this part, we're going to need our crochet hook. We are going to be working with the first row of the working yarn, so the dark blue over here, and we could see it clearly contrasting with the waste yarn. So open it a little bit and you'll notice that on one side there's a half a stitch instead of a whole one. You can see that the tail is going towards up and not towards down, so that's how we know that this stitch is not finished. So take your hook and place it into that little stitch from the working yarn and also into the hook that has the tail of the waste yarn. Go into those two loops, then pull the tail of the working yarn through those two, and here we've finished that half stitch and we have the whole stitch done. Now what we're going to do is we're going to count back, beginning from the last stitch on the row. We're going to count back 11 stitches, so exactly half of our work. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Insert your hook into that stitch from the working yarn. Then take the stitch right next to it and pull it through. Next, take the stitch from the first side and pull it through. And then this next stitch from the other side and pull it through. And go on doing this all along the row, pulling each time from the other side, each stitch into each other to close it off. Once you've reached the last, take the tail, pull it through that last loop to secure. And that's it. Now we can remove the waste yarn. We're going to repeat this process on the other side of the panel. Just that here we don't need to do that extra half a stitch. As you can see, the tail is towards down, and we just start by counting 11 stitches and begin closing. Repeat this process for all your panels, first knotting the ends of the color changes and then closing the top and the bottom. Before we begin sewing the panels together, we want to make sure that we align them correctly. So they should be opposite colors next to each other to create the checkerboard effect. So each panel has one side with a tail and one side without. So we're going to align a side without a tail to a side with a tail. Then take a piece of yarn, it doesn't really matter which color, and put it on your needle. Now take those two panels and align them and find the row that's exactly on the side of V's going towards down. We can see that there are V's going up and V's going down. We want the row that has V's going downwards. Here it is on this side, and find the aligning one on the other panel. V's going down. Align them both next to each other. And what we're going to do is we're going to go in between the V to the kind of head of the V and pick them up from each side to sew them together. So find that first V. It can be a little hard to find since it's with the tail, but you should be able to find the head of the V. Go into it. Pull the yarn almost all the way, leaving a little tail. Then find the first V of the second panel and go into that one. Careful not to pull too much. Then again, find the head of the V on the first panel and go into that one. And then from the second panel. And like this, going back and forth, we're going to sew together the two panels by the heads of the V's. As you're going along, make sure that you're going on the same row for the whole time, and you shouldn't by mistake change a different row and then mess things up. Just make sure that you're following the same row the whole time. When you've reached the top of your panels, now I'm just going to make a little knot into itself to secure it. And then hide the tail inside, in between the layers of the blanket. Cut off the extra yarn. Then I'm going to do the same for this other tail that's right over here. Next, we are going to close the tails at the bottom, but first we're going to make sure that it doesn't pull the work, because if it pulls it a little bit, then it's just going to get all scrunched up. So make sure that it's stretched out nicely, and then we can tie the tails and hide them in. And that's how we connect our panels. So just continue doing this process of sewing the panels together until your blanket is all done. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. All the best!